My mother works in an office and I know how often women are pushed out what they have built themselves. This isn't just a story for clicks, it's based on real experience. If you work in a team, listen carefully. All the names and companies here are fictional, but the mistakes are real. Don't repeat them.
The email hit my inbox at 6:23 a.m. sharp. Your termination has been processed, it said. Please review the attached package. I closed my eyes for a moment. Just a moment. No anger, no panic. I'd seen this coming for months, maybe longer. Lexi had been pulling away, edging me out with polite smiles. The thanks for your contributions kind of gratitude. She had a way of making it all sound like she was doing me a favor by acknowledging my work, as if the walls we'd built together over the years meant less than the shiny new gloss of her own success. I wasn't angry. I was numb. The office, our office, was quiet, the early morning light casting long shadows over the empty desks. Myriatech had come a long way since the two-desk startup in that dusty warehouse. We had built this together, but she had outgrown me, and I was being quietly discarded. I stared at the screen, watching the cursor blink back at me from the termination letter. The words blurred for a second. The CEO's email was formal, impersonal, what I expected. The language, the legal jargon, felt like a strange echo in the air. Print this and sign, it said. Lexi. She hadn't even called. It didn't surprise me, but it still stung. I had spent 10 years here, 10 years making sure every system was running smoothly, keeping things from falling apart behind the scenes. Now, I was just another casualty of the next phase of the company's evolution. I looked over to the fax machine across the room, where the only sign of life was the soft whir of paper being drawn through. I had prepared for this. Hell, I'd known it was coming. Over the past few months, I'd watched Lexi's star rise while mine was tucked away behind stacks of compliance reports and process diagrams. Every meeting felt more like a formality. She was the face of Myriatech now. She was the one people talked about, not me. It was always her ideas, her vision. And I was just the guy who fixed the problems that showed up at midnight. When the fax came through, I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I reached for the papers and signed. Quietly. Efficiently, no drama. I scanned the signed copy and sent it back with one click. No argument, no attempt to change her mind. This wasn't about fighting anymore. It was about watching her make her move and making sure mine was already in place. I watched her through the glass. Her office was a fortress of glass and polished steel. She was sitting there, frowning at her screen, clearly unaware of the storm she had just unleashed. 5 minutes passed. Then another 5. She opened my email. I saw her expression shift, just for a second, a moment of recognition. The color drained from her face as she read the attached clause summary. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her, but that moment was gone as quickly as it came. I knew exactly what I had triggered. And now, she did too. There was no going back now. This wasn't just about me being fired. It was about what she had forgotten, what she had never bothered to double-check. That clause? It wasn't just a handshake deal. It was a lifeline I had woven into the fabric of our company. The legal clause Lexi had triggered, the one she thought was irrelevant, was my silent insurance policy. Schedule A, line 12, the key person clause. Irrevocable ownership of foundational intellectual property unless terminated for cause. And it wasn't just my rights. It was the company's lifeblood. Every line of code, every framework, every protocol. The thing we built Myriatech on was still mine, and now she had just handed it all back to me. As the morning dragged on, the usual hum of the office was punctuated by frantic whispers. I could hear the soft click-clack of keyboards from the open offices, but the tension in the air had shifted. By noon, I got the call. It wasn't from Lexi. She had gone silent. The board was reaching out, desperate to find a collaborative resolution, as if this was some sort of misunderstanding. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The audit trail spoke for itself. Every system I had worked on, every authentication step, every line in the IP ownership ledger, all of it was there, time-stamped and irrefutable. I wasn't just leaving the company. No, this was something else entirely. I'll honor the agreement, the voice on the other end of the phone said, their voice trembling slightly. Then stop pretending $1 and a handshake don't count, I replied. There was no need for negotiation anymore. Lexi had triggered the clause, the terms were set. And now they were mine. It was over. I had been patient, but I wasn't going to let them rewrite history. I wasn't going to let them erase everything we had built. Not now. Not ever. As the day wound down and the emails began to flood in, I kept my calm. I stayed quiet. Every move I made now was a step toward claiming what was rightfully mine, and I wasn't going to let Lexi or anyone else take that from me. The clause had done its job, and now it was time to let the truth unfold. I could tell something was off as soon as Lexi walked into the boardroom. There was that look in her eyes, the one that wasn't quite friendly, but polished enough to pass as genuine. It was the kind of smile that you see on venture capitalists when they're about to pull the rug out from under you, but they still want you to think you're getting a good deal. The way she tilted her head, the way her hand brushed her hair behind her ear, it was all part of the performance. "Sit down, please," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "Let's talk." I had already been here before. It wasn't the first time Lexi had tried to pivot the conversation in her favor, shifting blame or making me the villain in her carefully curated narrative. This time, though, it felt different. "I've been thinking," she began, tapping the rim of her coffee cup. "You've done great things here. The company wouldn't be what it is without you. But I think it's time you explored what's next." I couldn't help it. A bitter laugh slipped out before I could stop it. "You're firing me, aren't you?" Her grin only widened. There was no hesitation, no effort to soften the blow. "We'll call it a restructure. HR will handle the rest. You know how it goes." Her words didn't hit me the way they should have. I had prepared myself for this moment. For weeks, maybe months now. I had seen the subtle hints, the polite distancing, the way the spotlight on me had slowly dimmed while it blazed brighter for her. I had watched as Lexi took over the roles I had once filled, leaving me in the background, forgotten like a relic of the past. The truth was, she didn't need me anymore, not for anything other than the title I held on paper. I sat there, sipping my coffee, watching her carefully, knowing the real reason she had asked me to meet. She needed to be sure I was boxed out without leaving any loose ends. I didn't say anything at first. My eyes never left hers, my expression steady. I had made peace with this. The company had always been her vision. I was just the architect, the problem solver, the one who made sure things worked behind the scenes. She was the one who attracted the investors, who led the press conferences. She had always been the face of MiriaTech, but I was the foundation. And foundations, no matter how invisible, hold everything up. "Lexi," I said, my voice calm, almost measured, "do you remember our founder agreement? The one we wrote with $1 and a handshake?" Her expression faltered for a moment, but only for a split second. "Of course, I remember, but we both agreed it's outdated now, right? The company's grown so much since then." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let my gaze drift toward the framed copy of our original charter hanging on the far wall, the one with our signatures at the bottom, her elegant cursive next to mine, both promising to see this thing through no matter how big it got. Later that night, after I had sent her a polite smile and walked out of that boardroom, I went back to my office and pulled out the dusty old file, the one that held the original charter. I ran my fingers over the pages, each line familiar yet tinged with the weight of years. Then, there it was. Schedule A, line 12, key person clause. Irrevocable ownership of foundational intellectual property contributions unless terminated for cause prior to Series D validation. I had done my homework. The clause was still active. And Lexi, in her rush to erase me, had just unwittingly triggered it. I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She hadn't fired me. No. Lexi had only triggered the clause that would take everything she thought was hers and return it to me. I had always known the day would come when the company would outgrow me. But what Lexi didn't know, what she had never bothered to check, was that the very thing she had built was still tied to my hands. Every line of code, every infrastructure upgrade, every compliance protocol that made MiriaTech work was something I had crafted. I wasn't just some guy who had worked on it for a decade. I was part of the bedrock. And now I held the keys. The filing timestamp was already recorded. Proof that Lexi had violated the clause when she fired me after Series D had been validated. The clause wasn't just a backup plan, a last-minute safeguard. It was my escape. My leverage. I didn't need to go through HR. I didn't need to play their game. I had already won. Tomorrow, I would send the email with the clause summary. It would be clear. Lexi had no idea what she had just done. And now, the countdown had started. The company she thought was hers, the unicorn she had worked so hard to build, was mine to reclaim, on my terms. I looked down at the document in front of me, the sharpness of the legal language sinking in. There was no undoing it. She had triggered it. The clause they had forgotten still breathed, and it was waiting for her to realize what it meant. And when she did, I would be the one holding all the cards. The clock ticked past midnight, and the quiet hum of my workstation felt like the calm before a storm. For the last 48 hours, I had been focused, almost obsessively, on the final task I had set for myself. It wasn't a long list of things to do, but each item was crucial to the smooth operation of Miriatech's backbone. I worked through the silence of the office, pushing through the slight hum of servers, typing with the precision that only years of experience could bring. System sync. End-to-end validation. It was the final ticket left open on my list, the last piece of the puzzle. After years of putting out fires and cleaning up the messes others left behind, this one task was mine alone to finish. It wasn't hard. It was just final. As I ran the last deployment script, I checked the timestamps one last time. The systems were ready. Everything was aligned. I was calm, almost detached. This wasn't about proving anything anymore. This was about doing what needed to be done before the axe fell. At 5:58 a.m., I pushed the final deployment. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a brief moment, and then the task was completed. I leaned back in my chair, watching the progress bars on my screen move from green to blue. The systems were secure. The sync was complete. Everything was done. I let the silence settle for a few seconds before I closed the file. At 6:22 a.m., the email came through from HR. It was the termination packet. The subject line was blunt: termination of employment. I didn't flinch. I didn't feel a rush of emotions, no sudden burst of anger or fear. There was just a quiet resignation, except this time it wasn't about accepting the inevitable. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I wasn't just going to leave. I wasn't just going to let it happen and disappear. I was going to make sure they understood what they had done. I opened the email, scanned it briefly, and then clicked on the attachment. I already knew what was inside. The usual formalities, the usual legal jargon. But I wasn't looking for their standard exit paperwork. I had something else in mind. I opened the file I had prepared earlier, the clause summary. I had anticipated this exact moment, had known that once the termination packet came, I would be the one to strike back. I scanned the document one more time, ensuring everything was in place. The key person clause, the timestamp proving Lexi had fired me after the Series D validation, the irrevocable ownership of my contributions to the company. With a final click, I attached the clause summary to my email reply, along with a simple message. Please find the requested documentation. I trust this clarifies our situation. I clicked send and leaned back in my chair. It was done. They thought they had fired me. But in reality, they had just handed me everything I needed. I didn't hear her come into the conference room, but I knew she was there. I could see the reflection of her figure through the glass wall, her silhouette outlined against the dim office lights. She was probably going over the latest meeting notes, checking her phone, whatever it was she did when she thought no one was watching. But I was watching. She sat down at the table, just as I had expected, and opened her laptop. A few clicks, a few moments of silence. Then, the look that I had been waiting for, the exact one I knew would come. Lexi opened the email. The moment she saw the attached clause summary, her body stiffened. There was no immediate reaction, no smile, no polite words of reassurance, just a moment of quiet realization. For a split second, I saw her lean back in her chair. Her eyes flicked to the screen, then back up to the room. It was the briefest pause. But in that instant, she understood exactly what had happened. She had triggered the clause. She had set in motion the exact thing she never saw coming. I could see her shoulders sag ever so slightly, a brief sign of the pressure building in her chest. She didn't smile this time. She didn't even flinch. There was no gloating on my part, no moment of triumph. I didn't need it. All I needed was to let her realize the truth in silence. She closed the laptop with a soft click and sat back, hands folded in front of her, still facing the screen. I watched through the glass, waiting. I could almost hear her thoughts racing, trying to piece everything together, but there was nothing more to figure out. She had signed off on all of it. The final validation steps, the authentication keys, the ownership ledgers. All of it was there. The legal and technical proof. The trail was already set. And now the company would have to reckon with the consequences. They thought they had just ended me. They thought they had won. But the truth was, I had already won this battle long before the email came through. At 6:23 a.m., I had sent my final reply. And in that one simple action, I had taken back what was rightfully mine. The clock ticked on as I sat back, listening to the faint sound of the city stirring beyond the office windows. The day was just beginning, and Lexi, still unaware of the consequences of her actions, was undoubtedly moving forward with her usual agenda. But she didn't know what had just happened. She didn't know the beast she had unleashed with a single decision, and it was only a matter of time before the full weight of it hit her. At 7:11 a.m., the first ripple of the storm made its way through the corporate layers. I heard the unmistakable sound of a ping in the silence of the office, sharp, sudden, and too important to ignore. It was a notification from legal. I couldn't see Lexi from where I sat, but I knew exactly how this would play out. Her eyes would flick to her screen, and she'd try to keep her cool. She always did. But this time, there was no pretending. I watched her fingers hover over her keyboard for a moment. The screen in front of her reflected the nervous energy in her posture, her back stiffening just slightly. Her fingertips tapped quickly, more out of habit than thought, as she typed her response. Was this termination authorized post-Series D validation? She didn't even stop to think. Her reply was swift, confident, almost too casual. Yes, why? And then, seconds later, legal's response came through. That activates Founding Clause 12. He retains full IP rights and partial equity under irreversible terms. There was a brief pause, one that seemed to stretch on for an eternity. The room around her grew heavier, filled with the weight of the legal language she was reading. The air felt thick with something unspoken, something she wasn't prepared for. I couldn't see her face, but I knew exactly what would happen next. I knew the look that would come over her eyes. The moment she realized what she had just done, she typed nothing for a long time. No reply, just silence. It stretched on, an eerie stillness settling in the air as the words sunk in. Then, finally, her hands faltered. I saw her glance at her screen one last time. There were no words, just the ellipsis, the endless drifting dots that hung in the air like the sound of a door slowly closing. No more smirks, no more confident replies. Just the faintest sign of her cracking, of the facade beginning to crumble. The truth had hit her in a way nothing else could. Lexi had been so focused on the next step, so eager to push me aside, that she had missed the details. She had overlooked the very clause she had signed off on all those years ago, the clause that made everything I had built hers by legal default. And now there was no turning back. For the next few moments, nothing happened. The quiet was unbearable. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, the rapid-fire thoughts trying to piece everything together. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. There was no backpedaling from this. I knew the legal team would be scrambling. I knew they would be questioning their own actions, wondering how they had missed something so crucial. They would be looking at the paperwork, double-checking the timestamps, confirming that it wasn't just a mistake. But the truth was, it didn't matter anymore. The clause had been activated. The IP rights were mine. The equity was mine. Lexi couldn't take it back. Her response, or lack thereof, was all I needed to know. It was the beginning of the end for her. The panic had already started. She just hadn't realized how deep it ran. I took a breath, the calm settling over me. I had already won without lifting a finger. The pieces had fallen into place. And now, it was her turn to pick up the pieces of what she had broken. By noon, the phone rang. I could feel the tension in the air as the number flashed on the screen. It was an unknown number, too controlled to be a coincidence. I already knew who it was, but I let the call go through anyway. Hello? My voice was calm, neutral. Hi, is this... The voice hesitated, then continued. This is Jack from the board. Lexi would like to find a collaborative resolution. She wants to talk. I leaned back in my chair and stared out the window, letting the silence stretch for a moment. I could practically see the smoke rising from their end of the line, the desperation seeping through every syllable. Collaborative resolution, I repeated slowly, savoring the phrase. It wasn't a request. It was a demand disguised as an invitation, but I had no intention of playing their game anymore. I don't think there's much to discuss, I said, my voice almost a whisper. The issue was settled when Lexi triggered Clause 12. There was a brief silence on the other end. I could almost hear Jack scrambling for his next words, trying to maintain his composure despite the obvious shift in power. We know the clause was triggered, but Lexi believes... Don't, I interrupted, my tone sharp enough to cut through the attempt at politeness. She signed off on all of it during the Series D filing, the validation logs, the authentication steps, the IP ownership ledger. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle between us. The truth had already been laid bare. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to make threats. The documentation, the timestamps, everything was there, irrevocable and permanent. It was all on paper, and they knew it. Don't waste your time trying to clean this up, I continued, quieter now, as if talking to a child who had already been caught. The audit trail is clean. The reversion clause was in effect. And now you're the one who has to deal with the fallout. Another long silence, thick with the weight of reality pressing down on them. They had nowhere to hide, no legal loopholes left to exploit, no way to cover their tracks. Every step they had taken was traceable, every decision they made recorded in black and white. They could try to negotiate all they wanted, but there was no bargaining left. I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do for you, I said, leaning forward slightly. The clause stands. You'll need to deal with Lexi directly. But just know this. Her decisions got us here, not mine. I let that hang in the air for a moment. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even frustrated. I was simply done. I'll make sure the paperwork is finalized and sent over by the end of the day, I added. And after that, we're finished. I didn't wait for him to respond. There was no need. The call ended with a soft click, the line going dead in my ear. I set the phone down slowly, almost absently, then looked at the screen in front of me. There was no more need for games. The legal side of it had been handled. The strategy was already in motion. I wasn't angry at Lexi. I wasn't even disappointed. I just felt indifferent. The whole thing had been so predictable. She had always relied on her charm, her ability to manipulate the narrative, but she had underestimated the quiet power I'd held all along. The ball was now in their court, and I wasn't going to chase them down to remind them of their mistake. The paperwork would arrive, and with it, the truth, and there was nothing they could do to change it. The phone buzzed again, this time the call coming from an unfamiliar area code. I didn't need to see who was on the other end. I could already guess. The calm detachment that had filled me earlier in the day began to shift as I pressed the receiver to my ear. Hello? I asked, my voice even, controlled. Hello, this is Karen from MiriaTech's legal team. We've been reviewing the documents and, well, we've found an issue. I sat up straight, letting the words hang in the air for a moment. I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to. I already knew where this was headed. They had found the trigger. We didn't realize that Founding Clause 12 came with an additional stipulation, Karen continued, her voice tight with the strain of trying to remain professional. If a founding contributor is removed post-valuation milestone, the licensing must be renegotiated, or usage halts entirely. We need to address that immediately. I smiled softly to myself, feeling the shift in the room, the weight of their realization. This wasn't just a clause that protected my IP. It was a blade I'd kept sharp for this exact moment. What are you saying? I asked, my voice low. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I knew Karen was checking notes, likely confirming the details on her side. Finally, she spoke again, her words rushed and clipped. What we're saying is, all your contributions to MiriaTech, every line of code, every compliance protocol, every system you designed, they all revert to you. And since you're now the sole owner of those assets, the company can no longer use them without your approval. All licensing for those contributions must be renegotiated, or it stops. I let the silence hang for a beat. This was the moment. This was the second hit. They hadn't even seen it coming. And Miriatech's unicorn status? I asked, letting the question linger in the air. Is it still intact? Not without your consent, she replied, barely able to hide the panic in her voice. And that means until this is resolved, their valuation is on hold. The board is scrambling. We're losing leverage. I could practically hear the walls closing in on them. They hadn't just lost a key person. They had lost the entire foundation of what made their unicorn status worth anything at all. Karen, I said, the words measured, precise. Here's how this goes. You'll pay me $380,000 in immediate compensation. That's for the usage of my intellectual property. And then the post-valuation equity will be calculated at $1.1 million, non-negotiable. Another long silence. I could feel the tension tightening, the weight of their desperation bleeding through the phone. The money wasn't even the point anymore. It was about the control. Non-negotiable? She repeated, disbelief creeping into her voice. But that? Non-negotiable, I interrupted, my voice calm. The numbers are firm. This isn't about a negotiation. It's about paying for what you've been using all along. You want to keep your unicorn status intact? Then you pay me what I'm owed. And once that's done, we can renegotiate. But make no mistake. Everything I've built stays with me. Until you pay, Miriatech is a liability. A very expensive one. I could hear her breathing on the other end, but there was no arguing left to do. The truth was clear. The clause wasn't just a shield, it was a weapon, cutting through all their carefully laid plans. She finally spoke, quieter now, but the resignation in her voice was unmistakable. We'll get the paperwork in motion. I smiled again, this time a little colder. I could almost hear the scrambling in the background. The board, the investors, everyone who had been counting on Miriatech's status, their quiet panic would set the pace from here on out. I set the phone down, the silence in my office now more pronounced than ever. They had underestimated me. They had underestimated the quiet leverage I had built, the foresight that had gone into every decision I made. The clause, once dormant, had now turned into a powerful force, a force that would be felt across every layer of Miriatech. They had wanted me out, but they had never fully understood what they were setting in motion. And now? Now they would pay for their oversight. The game had shifted, and I was the one in control. The next day, just as I had expected, the call came. This time, it wasn't from Lexi. I hadn't heard from her since the email exchange. In fact, I hadn't expected to hear from her again. Not after everything had unfolded. The control had shifted, and she was no longer the one calling the shots. It was someone from the board. A man I hadn't worked with much, but his voice was familiar from a few of the meetings I had attended in the early years, back when Miriatech still felt like a team and not just a machine running on its own momentum. Is this Morgan Dalton? He asked, the voice tight with something unspoken. Yes, I replied, calm, controlled. We're prepared to honor all prior agreements, he said quickly, not wasting time with pleasantries. We'll make sure your compensation is processed immediately, the $380,000, the equity, everything. We just want to keep this from the press. Let's keep it between us. I didn't react right away. I didn't need to. This was part of the game now, their attempt at damage control. They knew exactly how much trouble they were in, and they knew that if this went public, it wouldn't just be Lexi's head on the chopping block. It would be the entire company's reputation. I had already won. There was no negotiating left to do. The terms were set. Sure, I said, my voice quiet but firm. But here's the thing. You're asking me to keep this quiet. You're asking me to protect your reputation. But let's be clear about something. I paused for a beat, letting the words sink in, letting them feel the weight of the truth. Stop pretending $1 and a handshake don't count. I could hear him falter, just a slight catch in his breath. The silence stretched out between us, long and thick. They were trying to rewrite history, trying to erase the foundation we'd both built this company on. They wanted to pretend the moment that had set everything in motion didn't matter, that the handshake Lexi and I had shared all those years ago, the one that had started this whole thing, was just a formality. But it wasn't. And it wasn't something they could ignore anymore. I wasn't going to let them sweep this under the rug. I wasn't going to pretend that the original agreement didn't still bind us all. If you want to fix this, I continued, my voice calm, steady, you'll honor it all. Everything. Not just the numbers, not just the payout, but the understanding we built this on. He was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear the tension building in his voice when he finally responded. We will. We'll do whatever it takes. Just, please, let's keep this between us. We don't want any more attention on this than we already have. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. I wasn't worried about attention. In fact, I was enjoying the silence, the way the power had shifted without a single word from me. I wasn't chasing headlines. I wasn't chasing recognition. All I needed was to make sure they knew one thing. Lexi had lost control. I'll handle it, I said before ending the call. There was no need for any more words. No need for them to beg or explain. The truth had been laid out, and there was no way to take it back. The game had shifted, and Lexi had lost. 2 weeks later, I found myself in Palo Alto sitting on a panel at a startup governance conference. The topic was innocent enough. Early clauses that outlive the hype. A discussion for founders, VCs, and legal experts about the critical clauses in early-stage agreements that shaped a company's future and how those clauses could come back to haunt them. I had agreed to participate, but there was no real excitement on my part. The panel would be informative, sure, but I had my own reasons for attending. I wasn't here to network or to flaunt my expertise. I was here to remind them all, Lexi in particular, that no one could outlast the contract. No one could erase history. As I took my seat, I spotted her in the front row. Lexi. She was trying to blend in, as she always did, sitting straight-backed with her sharp corporate smile, her eyes scanning the room, perhaps trying to act as though she was above it all. The same smile she had worn when she'd pushed me out, when she thought everything would fall into place without me. I didn't look at her directly, but I knew she was watching. The panel discussion began, and the moderator, a well-dressed entrepreneur with a smooth, practiced delivery, introduced the first case study. I could feel the atmosphere shift slightly when he announced it. And now, he said, flipping through his notes, we have a particularly interesting case study, one that deals with founder agreements and the importance of legal foresight in early-stage ventures. He paused dramatically, letting the tension build. This one involves a situation where a key founder's rights were protected by a very specific clause, a clause that, when activated, had irreversible consequences, the case of Myriatech. I kept my expression neutral, but I could feel every pair of eyes in the room shift toward me. There was no turning back now. I had expected this moment. I had anticipated it, and now I would let it play out. I glanced at Lexi. She had frozen for a split second, her eyes darting toward me, then quickly looking away. She wasn't prepared for this. She thought I had walked away quietly, content to let her have her unicorn status. But she had never understood the depth of the clause we had written, of the leverage it gave me. The moderator continued, explaining the finer details of the clause, not realizing he was presenting the terms of my quiet victory to an entire room of investors, entrepreneurs, and legal experts. In this case, he explained, the key person clause was triggered post-Series D, giving the founder irrevocable control of intellectual property rights. The founder not only retained full ownership of foundational contributions, but also partial equity that could not be undone unless mutually agreed upon. The consequence? A halt to any further use of the company's intellectual property until terms were renegotiated. The silence in the room grew. It wasn't just the words themselves. It was the implication of what had happened. This wasn't an obscure legal nuance. This was the heart of the company being cut out. And now, Lexi's past decisions were being laid bare. I didn't need to say a word. The moderator looked down at his notes, oblivious to the sudden tension in the air. The company, originally on track to close a major funding round, was forced to renegotiate licensing terms with the founder, resulting in a hefty payout and a restructuring of the company's equity. It's a rare case, but it serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of understanding the consequences of those early decisions. The audience murmured quietly, taking in the lesson. But I didn't look at them. I kept my gaze on Lexi. She was staring straight ahead now, her jaw tight, her hands folded in her lap. Her face was unreadable, but I could see it in her posture, the way her knees shifted slightly, betraying the tension building inside her. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't raised her hand to ask questions. She wasn't even looking at me directly. Her silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. She knew the truth now. Everyone in this room knew it too. This wasn't just a case of a clause protecting a founder's rights. This was a public consequence of her miscalculations. It was the reminder that even in the fast-paced world of startups, some things couldn't be overlooked. Some things had a price. She had lost control, and there was no undoing that. As the discussion moved on, I remained still, calm. My part was over. I had made my point without saying a word. Lexi didn't ask a single question. Her silence confirmed everything I needed to know. She had lost. 3 months had passed since the panel discussion, and in that time, the dust had settled. The echo of Lexi's quiet defeat still lingered in the air, though neither of us spoke of it directly. Not that she ever would. The game had shifted. The power dynamics irrevocably altered. MiriaTek, once the jewel of Silicon Valley, was now scrambling to reassemble what they had broken. Their foundation cracked under the weight of my quiet leverage. It wasn't long before I received word from my lawyer that the MiriaTek had updated their corporate charter. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was everything. All the key person triggers that had once defined the company's ownership and equity structure were quietly removed. Lexi and the board had come to terms with the inevitable. They had no choice but to rewrite history, erasing the clauses that had once protected them from losing control over the company's most valuable assets, my assets. It was a quiet victory. They didn't announce it to the press. No big headlines, no dramatic statements. But the move was significant. A quiet acknowledgement of their surrender. By the time the paperwork came through, my final payout was processed. I cashed the check, my compensation for the years of contributions, and for the IP rights I had retained. It was everything I was owed, and more. I sat at my desk, looking over the documents one last time, and for the first time in months, I felt the weight of everything lift. My intellectual property, everything I had built, had been formally retired from MiriaTek, but it hadn't been stripped from me. I had walked away on my terms. No one had forced me to sign anything. No one had dictated the conditions. I had held the reins the entire time, even when they thought they had taken control. I signed the final documents with a steady hand. No fanfare, no flourish. This was the end. The conclusion of a long and deliberate chapter. Afterward, I made the decision to join a new firm as a strategic partner. It was the right move, the next logical step in a career that had always been about more than just the next venture. This time, I would build from a position of true power with a team that respected the value of quiet, strategic leverage. I didn't expect Lexi to reach out, and she didn't. Not a single word. No apologies, no thanks, nothing. But that, too, was part of the deal. She knew where she had gone wrong, and there was no need for reconciliation. The terms had been set. She had lost everything, twice. Once when she underestimated me, and again when she tried to rewrite the rules. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to explain myself. Everything I had built, the systems, the protocols, the very backbone of MiriaTek was mine. The rest? That was hers to deal with. In the end, Lexi had paid for it twice. And I walked away quietly, knowing that the real leverage was never in the boardroom. It had always been embedded in the beginning, in the handshake, in the trust we had built, and in the clauses we had signed. And now I was free.